The attacker made no pause and advanced with slow, deliberate motion toward her. He then swung the blade down and drove it deep into the woman's back. Blood arced across the lens as she gasped once and clutched at the wound. She stumbled forward and collapsed while the attacker still held the knife high. The feed froze on the blade's dark silhouette and the victim's falling form. The camera feed had captured the attack in relentless detail. A knife hovered in cold light above the frame as the woman turned and stared. Blood already marked her coat, and a wet line tracked her back. A nearby man stood dazed with fresh cuts on his cheek. A gloved hand gripped the blade, and a shadowed figure stepped forward and spoke Jae-hyun's name. The attacker asked final words and then advanced with slow, deliberate motion. He swung the blade down and drove it deep into her back. Blood arced across the lens as she gasped and clutched the wound. She stumbled and collapsed while the feed froze on the blade's dark silhouette. Online viewers flooded the comments. Someone ran down the hallway and opened the door to the frozen scene. The feed and the room became proof of the moment. The frame opened on a knife, hovering in stark light above the scene. A woman turned and stared toward the camera with blood staining her coat. A nearby man stood dazed, his cheek torn and eyes unfocused. A gloved hand tightened on the blade as a shadowed figure stepped forward. The figure spoke Jae-hyun's name in a steady quiet and halted the room. He asked a final question, then advanced with slow, deliberate pace. The blade came down and plunged deep into the woman's back. Blood arced across the lens as she gasped and clawed at the wound. She stumbled and collapsed, the feed froze on the knife's dark silhouette. Someone sprinted down the hallway, opened the door, and found the tableau. The recording and the room together became hard evidence of the act. The sequence opened on a knife, descending in stark light above a woman. A nearby man reeled in shock, his cheek torn and eyes unfocused. A gloved hand tightened on the blade as a shadowed figure stepped forward and spoke. He said Jae-hyun's name in a steady voice, then asked a final question. He advanced with slow, deliberate pace and brought the knife down into her back. Blood arced across the lens as she gasped and clawed at the wound. She stumbled, collapsed, and the feed froze on the knife's dark silhouette. Someone sprinted down the hallway, opened the door, and found the tableau. Shouts rose as people moved through the room and checked the victim. Responders noted overturned furniture, scattered belongings, and fresh marks on the floor. The recording and the room together became hard evidence of the act. The attack began when a shadowed figure seized Jae-hyun from behind and covered her mouth. The figure spoke Jae-hyun's name in a low, steady voice and asked a final question. A gloved hand tightened on a blade that flashed cold blue. He advanced with slow, deliberate steps and drove the knife deep into Jae-hyun's back. Blood arced across the lens as she gasped, clawed at the wound, and staggered. She stumbled and fell, the feed froze on the knife's dark silhouette above her. Someone sprinted down the hallway, opened the door, and discovered the bloody tableau. Shouts rose as bystanders rushed in and checked Jae-hyun's breathing and wounds. Responders recorded overturned furniture, scattered belongings, and fresh marks on the floor. The recording and the scene together became physical evidence of the assault. Broadcasters replayed the recorded assault, and the case moved into public view. A viewer watched the news feed in silence and studied the grainy frames. Anchors narrated overturned furniture, scattered belongings, and the pool of blood near Jae-hyun's body. A reporter described the corridor footage and the silhouetted figure advancing with a blade. The images repeated until the details settled in the viewer's mind. Outside, crowds and cameras gathered at the reported site. The viewer remembered the flash of steel in Jae-hyun's collapse, then mouthed a plan aloud. They declared that the plan was theirs and that they intended to kill people like them. Close-ups showed a narrowed eye and a steadying breath. The broadcast cut to other stories, but the viewer kept watching. The vow hung between frames and hardened into a decision. Broadcasters replayed the recorded assault and dragged the event into public view. A grainy timer counted down above a wounded figure lying on the corridor floor. Jae-hyun coughed and tried to speak as a dark silhouette advanced in light. The on-screen watcher narrowed an eye and steadied a hand with silent resolve. A countdown leap and a close-up emphasized the attacker preparing to strike. Jae-hyun whispered why, while blood darkened the shirt and breath grew shallow. The attacker answered that the act had to be done and turned away. The feed cut and returned, but the vow in the frames held firm. Outside, crowds gathered and cameras braced, while intent petrified into a dangerous plan. A lone figure left the camera's edge, carrying the burden of that hardened promise. Broadcasters replayed the recorded assault and forced the footage into public view. A grainy timer counted down while Jae-hyun lay wounded on the corridor floor. The attacker appeared as a dark silhouette advancing within the camera light. Jae-hyun coughed and tried to speak, but breath and voice grew thin. The on-screen watcher steadied a hand and fixed a cold resolve silently. A close-up showed the attacker preparing to strike as blood darkened Jae-hyun's shirt. The attacker answered that the act had to be done and then turned away. The live feed cut and returned while viewers outside gathered and cameras braced. A lone figure left the frame, carrying the burden of a hardened pledge. Then at the point of silence, something strange interrupted the sequence with a sudden clang. The final shots cut to a silhouette whose eyes glinted, as if recognizing a threat. Broadcasters streamed the assault footage and forced the images into public view. A grainy counter tracked time while Jae-hyun lay bleeding in the corridor. A dark silhouette moved steadily forward within the camera's weak washed light. Jae-hyun tried to cough and form words, but then her breath failed. A close shot showed the attacker readying a final motion as blood soaked Jae-hyun's shirt. The attacker spoke that the deed had to be done, then turned away. The live broadcast cut and resumed as crowds and cameras pressed outside. One lone figure silently exited the frame while carrying an unspoken pledge. At that silent instant, a sudden clang ripped through and disrupted the flow. The last frames lingered on a silhouette whose eyes flashed in recognition. The image then descended into blue light that rattled Jae-hyun's chest hard. She trembled uncontrollably as bright light struck and the attacker loomed nearer. The footage closed on two people sitting together watching the playback in silence. A single terse line was spoken, and the central question remained unresolved. The footage had been forced into public view as a counter ticked. Jae-hyun lay bleeding in the corridor, and she tried to form words. A washed light revealed a dark silhouette moving steadily forward across the floor. Close shots showed the attacker readying a final motion as blood soaked Jae-hyun's shirt. The broadcast cut and then resumed while crowds and cameras pressed outside. One lone figure silently exited carrying an unspoken pledge before a sudden clang. Blue light struck and Jae-hyun trembled uncontrollably as the attacker loomed nearer. In the viewing room, a speaker at a podium said the numbers would not fall. The playback stuttered into static, then suddenly exploded into raw, violent struggle. Assailants lunged and grappled over Jae-hyun, while a voice screamed, "She's mine." The last frames held two people watching in silence and a terse, unresolved line. A digital counter flashed, and the footage bled into public screens. Jae-hyun lay on the corridor floor, clutching her chest and trying to speak. A white light revealed an attacker advancing with deliberate steps. Close frames showed blood saturating Jae-hyun's shirt and the final motion of assault. The broadcast stuttered, then cut and resumed while crowds gathered outside. One figure exited silently before a sudden clang broke the scene. Blue light struck and Jaehyun trembled as the attacker loomed and lunged. Hands grappled and bodies collided over her while a voice screamed possession. The last frames held two observers watching in silence and a terse, unresolved line. Investigators later replayed the frames, searching for any identifying detail or clue. Public screens across the station had shown the counter and the footage in loop. Jaehyun had lain on the corridor floor, clutching her chest and trying to speak. A harsh white light had revealed an attacker advancing with deliberate steps. Close frames had shown blood soaking Jaehyun's shirt and the final motion of the assault. The broadcast had stuttered, cut, and resumed while crowds gathered outside the building. One figure had exited the frame and left before a sudden clang punctured the scene. Blue light had swept the corridor as Jaehyun trembled and the attacker lunged again. Hands had grappled, bodies had collided over her while a voice screamed about possession. The last frames had held two observers watching in silence and a terse, unresolved line. Investigators later replayed the footage repeatedly, pausing on grainy angles for any clue. After the station footage stopped, attention moved toward the building's lit exterior. A patrol car flashed blue while a second vehicle idled nearby in the street. The second car's tires screamed as it left the curb and accelerated away. Cameras lingered on the wheel as motion blurred the rim and hub. Inside, Jaehyun lay slumped across the seat with blood on her collar. Her breathing came in shallow rasps and small noises escaped her lips. The driver kept both hands tight on the wheel and stared straight ahead. He did not speak as the city blurred past under overcast twilight. The vehicle merged onto the highway and the taillights receded into dusk. Investigators later froze each frame, searching for a link or motive. Jaehyun regained consciousness in the dark car and slowly forced her eyes open. A cold dashboard lamp cut across her face as she tried to focus. She coughed and pressed two fingers to her throat while panic tightened her chest. Her hand brushed fabric, then a bare foot slid over the floor. Outside, the vehicle had stopped beside a skeletal industrial building under an overcast sky. She climbed out, stood unsteady, and scanned the compound with wide, searching eyes. She called one thin word and then asked desperately where she was. Two figures in a nearby doorway reacted. One insisted they could not leave her behind. Investigators later froze these frames to link the car's arrival with first witnesses' statements. Jaehyun had just forced her eyes open in the dark car and climbed out. A cold dashboard lamp had cut across her face as she moved. She staggered across gravel and stopped when a tall man filled a doorway. Fragmented flash images of a struggle flared in her mind and tightened her breath. The man advanced a step and spoke in a quiet, even voice that made her flinch. She tried to answer, but panic pushed her into motion and she ran past him. Her shoes scraped the concrete and a heel left a visible scuff as she fled. Loose papers blew from a bag and trailed across the yard. The man watched for a beat, then followed at a steady pace. Investigators later used these frames to sequence her flight and his approach against witness statements. Jaehyun stumbled and screamed as she broke into the open lot near an industrial garage. Workers and a driver looked up toward a dark van that idled beneath the roof. Jaehyun hesitated at the van door, then peered inside with shaking hands. A figure sat in shadow on the rear bench and held a blade in one hand. He spoke in a low, measured voice that made her pause and breathe faster. She pressed trembling tissues to a wound that bled through her shirt. The man's face remained mostly hidden, but investigators later matched his gait and stance. Shelving and labeled boxes in a storage aisle closed the scene in cold light. These sequential frames later helped the investigator place movements against witness statements. Jae-hyun stumbled into the open lot near an industrial garage and screamed. Workers and a driver looked up as a dark van idled beneath the roof. She hesitated at the van door and peered inside with shaking hands. A man sat in shadow on the rear bench and held a blade in one hand. He spoke in a low, measured voice that froze her breath and made her pulse fast. She pressed trembling tissues to a wound that bled through her shirt. The man's face remained mostly hidden, but later investigators matched his gait and stance to other footage. Shelving and labeled boxes in a storage aisle framed the scene in cold light. The investigator reviewed sequential frames and linked movements to witness statements. The footage suggested a list of targets and placed Jae-hyun among them. In the final moments, she stood bloodied beneath silent faces and shifted into a hard gaze. Jae-hyun stumbled from the van into the storage lot and screamed. Workers and a driver looked up as a dark van idled beneath the low roof. She hesitated at the sliding door and peered inside with shaking hands. A man sat in shadow on the rear bench and held a blade in one hand. He spoke in a low, measured voice and counted figures while handling a small red object. Jae-hyun pressed trembling tissues to a wound that bled through her shirt. She froze when he addressed her and forced a reply after a brief pause. The man's face remained mostly hidden, but his hand movements were deliberate and distinct. The investigator reviewed sequential frames and linked those motions to other footage and to witness statements. The review suggested a list of targets and placed Jae-hyun among them. A caption in the footage recorded her thought about answering his question. In the final frames, she lay bloodied beneath silent faces and shifted into a hard, steady gaze. The investigator replayed footage, showing the attacker seated and counting in a low voice. Jae-hyun hesitated at the van door and pressed tissues against a bleeding wound. The attacker demanded an answer and suggested sacrifice to avoid being killed. Inside a car, a young woman smiled weakly and lied about another boy's devotion. A caption explained small tests and counted targets, reducing the list to 1. The investigator matched the attacker's hand motions to other clips and witness statements. He handled a small red object, while his hand movements remained deliberate and distinct. Witnesses and the coroner later referenced the sequence when naming possible motives. Final frames showed Jae-hyun collapsed, but looking through steady eyes at the camera. The evidence narrowed suspects and left a single number assigned to her case. The investigator replayed the van footage and watched Jae-hyun press tissues to a wound. The attacker sat nearby and counted targets in a low voice while testing responses. Jae-hyun hesitated at the door and said she had killed a man. A brief exchange named another survivor and suggested sacrifice to avoid death. The scene cut to a figure walking down a corridor carrying a small object. The investigator matched the attacker's hand motions to prior clips and witness statements. He noted deliberate gestures that repeated across recordings and pointed to motive. Witnesses and the coroner later referenced the sequence when naming possible motives. Investigators narrowed suspects until a single number remained assigned to the case. Jae-hyun collapsed but kept steady eyes fixed on the camera. The investigator reviewed footage showing Jae-hyun pressing tissues against her wound in the van. The screen cut to puppet-like replays of limbs ripped apart and falling apart. He matched the attacker's hand motions to the repeats and to witness statements. A lone figure walked across a station platform with shoulders bent against the cold. Voice bubbles insisted it did not matter and that they would be fine. In another clip, a hand slammed down and a camera startled at the impact. Later, the unknown man and Jae-hyun faced each other in a shadowed room. The unknown man praised Jae-hyun's preservation of evidence while keeping his face hidden. He leaned close and asked if she finally understood what her situation meant. Jaehyun held steady eyes and offered no clear answer as lights cut out. The investigator reviewed footage of Jaehyun pressing tissues to her wound in the van. The screen cut to puppet-like replays of limbs and sudden impacts that jolted the frame. He matched the attacker's hand motions to the replays and witness statements. The clip then returned to a cramped van moving under weak streetlights. A dark figure drove while Jaehyun sat behind him, shaken and alert. She whispered, "Where are we?" and demanded to know if she was being taken. The driver answered that he had no fixed destination but would take her anyway. His voice grew colder as he insisted she would come with him henceforth. Jaehyun bristled and refused to be drawn into his actions, gripping her wound. The investigator watched the exchange, noting her steady resistance despite clear fear. The investigator watched as the clip shifted back to the van. A dark man spoke calmly and offered Jaehyun release. He flipped a phone toward her, and the screen showed footage and menacing text. He framed the choice as simple freedom or public exposure. Jaehyun recoiled, gripping her wound and refusing to surrender to his pressure. He pressed harder, asking what she would choose, and the camera caught her panic close up. She whispered protests and begged him not to release the file. The man lowered his face and smiled without mercy. The exchange ended with Jaehyun alone in the vehicle, trembling and clinging to hope. The investigator noted her fear and the leverage the man held over her future. The investigator watched the van from the clip as it continued to roll. Inside, the tall, dark-haired man drove without reaction, while Jaehyun pleaded for small mercies. She asked to stop at her house and to pack her clothes. She insisted she had things to do and that she needed to see her mother. The man remained silent and kept steady control of the steering wheel the whole time. The camera caught Jaehyun's face in close-up as panic flared and her voice trembled. She accepted the ride only under protest and then sank into silence. The van drove through the city toward a block of low buildings. The shot ended on a building lit at dusk, and the investigator registered how alone Jaehyun had become. After the van footage, the investigator queued up another clip from the same night. In the new frame, the unknown man walked a dim corridor with a low cap. He paused beneath a light, lowered his hand, and adjusted his hat. His face tightened as he approached a doorway banded with yellow tape. He reached out, tore the tape free, and eased the door open. A narrow room showed a jacket on the floor, an open cup of ramen, and scattered papers. A small desk bore a glowing monitor, and a chair turned toward the wall. The unknown man stepped inside, looked silently across the mess, and hesitated. The camera cut close on his features, catching a thin line of concern. The investigator noted the same isolation he had seen on Jaehyun's face. He marked the clip and let the footage run to the room's dark corner. The unknown man stepped into the cramped room and paused beneath the single dim light fixture. Jaehyun sat on the bed amid scattered clothes and a cold cup of ramen. He pulled his cap down, held his hands together, and listened to the room. The unknown man eased the door wider and peered through a narrow vertical crack. A pale hand and one wide eye slid past the half-open frame into shadow. The camera cut to the floor where a black bag and loose papers lay. A faint blue light glowed in unknown man's gaze as he formed a short sentence. He told Jaehyun that if she returned, there would be punishment and limits. Jaehyun froze, eyes widening, and a tremor of fear crossed her face. Unknown man remained seated, voice low, and repeated a final cold warning before the cut. The man had entered the cramped room and paused beneath the dim ceiling light. Jaehyun sat on the bed among scattered clothes and a cold cup of ramen. He lowered his cap, clasped his hands, and listened to the small space. He eased the door wider and glanced through the narrow vertical crack. A pale hand and one wide eye slipped through the gap into shadow. The camera cut to the floor where a black bag and loose papers lay. A faint blue light shone in his gaze as he formed a short sentence. Jae-hyun froze, her eyes widening, and a tremor of fear crossed her face. He remained seated, voice low, and repeated a cold warning before the cut. After the cut, he stepped into deeper shadow and gripped a broken bottle. One white eye reflected the faint light and stared through the darkness. He held his silence, then spoke a final short verdict in a rough voice. He spoke the two sharp words aloud, delivering them without mercy or pause. The scene cut to black, leaving a single stark verdict on the screen. Unknown man entered the cramped room and paused beneath the dim ceiling light. Jae-hyun sat on the bed among scattered clothes and a cold cup of ramen. She lowered her cap and clasped both hands as she listened to the small space. The man eased the door and glanced through the narrow vertical crack. A pale hand and one wide eye slipped through the gap into shadow. Footsteps echoed and white sneakers appeared in a close shoe shot. Jae-hyun froze, her eyes widened, and a tremor of fear crossed her face. He remained seated and spoke a low, cold warning before the scene cut. The door slid and showed only a narrow slit of darkness. The man stepped deeper into shadow, holding a shattered bottle as she waited. He then spoke two sharp words without mercy, and the screen cut to black. Unknown man watched from the doorway as the assailant raised a shattered bottle above Jae-hyun. The attacker swung down, and Jae-hyun screamed while the glass flashed under the light. The attacker grinned wildly as the bottle struck something and slipped from his hand. Unknown man closed the distance, seized the attacker, and forced him back against the wall. The assailant staggered and spat as the grip held. Unknown man called Jae-hyun's name. She froze, then lifted her cap and stared. Figures gathered at the room entrance and shouted relief. Jae-hyun trembled and mouthed thanks while the immediate threat faltered and the cramped room filled with urgent voices. Unknown man lunged forward and forced the assailant back against the wall until his movements slowed. Bystanders rushed the doorway and shouted, breaking the immediate danger. Jae-hyun froze, then lifted her cap and stared with trembling hands. She mouthed a thin thank you as shock warmed her face. The attacker staggered and spat while the grip held him steady. Unknown man stepped close and brushed hair aside to inspect a small cut on her cheek. Jae-hyun whispered that it was her fault and flinched away. He placed a steady hand on her shoulder and said it looked like only a scratch. Her shoulders loosened a fraction, and she agreed to let him check. Voices filled the cramped room as everyone tried to regain composure. After he had forced the assailant back and bystanders had surged forward, the room stayed noisy and unsettled. Unknown man called her name and rushed close when he saw her breathing. Jae-hyun managed a small smile and said she was glad he had come. She admitted fault and flinched as he checked a shallow cut on her cheek. His reassurance eased her shoulders by a fraction, but her eyes remained hollow. Later, she sat across from him with a thin file and a boxed suitcase nearby. He watched her read in silence, fingers tracing the paper without speaking. The cluttered apartment felt smaller as both avoided direct questions about her disappearance. At last, he tried to break the quiet with a name, and she only offered silence in return. The scene ended with them, seated opposite one another under steady lamplight and no clear answers. He found her slumped in the hallway and called out with a low greeting. She blinked and whispered a single name, then tried to stand. He steadied her shoulder and asked where she was going. She gave a half answer and clutched a boxed suitcase at her feet. They moved toward the stairwell while trading guarded questions. A sudden noise made him freeze and widen his eyes in alarm. He turned and saw a shadowed figure sprinting down the corridor. The figure slammed the stairwell door and vanished between floors. He fumbled for his phone and read a terse message that unsettled him. He promised to stay until she answered and waited silently. Neither offered a clear reason for her sudden departure. He had found her slumped earlier and stayed until she could answer questions. Later, he flipped through a photo on his phone. The image blurred and the screen went dark. At the hospital, she blinked awake and whispered while he steadied her shoulder. A small pendant fell and chimed as he rose to check the monitor. He read a terse printout aloud and compared timestamps to the numbers. The data suggested she had wandered through multiple locations and lost time. She flinched at the phrasing and clutched the bedrail. He then checked security footage for gaps and brief silhouettes in the corridor. He matched events to timestamps and waited for her memory to sharpen. Earlier, the investigator had stayed with her after finding her and reviewed footage. The recording cut to a silhouetted man who said, "Please convince her." Night streetlights revealed two figures passing a brick wall beside a building. One man confronted the other and shouted questions about killing someone nearby. The accused stumbled away with his head lowered and tears visible on his face. The aggressor demanded answers, urged him to admit guilt and make amends. From the camera angle, the investigator could only see the back of the man's head. The investigator realized the man could not perceive him despite his efforts to follow closely. Overlaid captions and messages recorded attempts to force memories and match timestamps. The investigator compared these fragments to earlier printouts and waited for her memory to resurface. The investigator had reviewed the earlier recording and then watched the confrontation play out. Night lights framed two figures near a brick wall. A tall man shouted and demanded answers about a nearby death. The accused staggered and lowered his head, tears wetting his face as he protested. The aggressor pressed him, saying it was not about proving anything. The accused countered that it was not that simple and insisted he was wrong. The scene cut into a brief flashback image of people crying and a man screaming. Captured captions and timestamps overlaid the footage. From the recording angle, the investigator could only see backs and profiles, and he remained out of their perception while notes and printouts were compared for memory matches. The investigator had reviewed earlier footage and watched the confrontation from a recording angle. He observed a distraught figure confessing under night light near a brick wall. The speaker said he had wanted to kill the man and had meant to stab his neck. He insisted he was not trying to hurt anyone, yet admitted violent intent. He considered the dead man a deranged murderer and wondered if he mirrored his father. At one point, he named number as part of that rationale. He then realized someone had come for him and decided to leave, apologizing. Footsteps crossed the frame as he turned and walked away into the street light. A distant voice called Jaehyun, and another voice ordered someone to stop right there. The investigator remained unseen while he compared that scene to timestamps and notes. The investigator reviewed the recording and watched the confrontation frame by frame. A distraught person stood under a night light beside a brick wall and spoke in a hoarse voice. He confessed he had wanted to kill and admitted he had planned to stab a man's neck. He insisted he had not intended to hurt others, though he owned violent intent. He labeled the dead man a deranged killer and briefly compared that man to his father. In the speech, he invoked number as part of his rationale. Footsteps crossed the frame, and he realized someone had come for him, so he decided to leave and apologized. A distant voice called Jaehyun, while another ordered someone to stop right there. The investigator stayed unseen and matched the scene to his timestamps and notes. The investigator continued reviewing the recording and matched it to his timestamps. A lone figure waited under a street lamp beside a low brick wall nearby. Another man approached from the shadow and stopped beside a parked car. The waiting man slid his hand along the door handle and opened it. He entered and sat in the driver's seat, the other lined in to speak. They exchanged terse lines. One accused the other of being late and demanded a reason. A brief apology followed, and the driver gripped the wheel to steady himself. The passenger agreed to ride along and promised to remain with him. Footsteps and mumbled words filled the frame as the car prepared to leave. Earlier, the distraught man had invoked number as part of his rationale that remained audible. The investigator paused, rewound, and logged each gesture and phrase into his notes. The investigator scrubbed the recording to follow every frame and timestamp precisely. Dawn lit a long highway as a single car moved toward the skyline. Two speech bubbles appeared over the scene, signaling a terse exchange inside the vehicle. The camera cut to the car interior, showing a hooded figure strapped into a seat. The figure kept both hands near the wheel and avoided direct eye contact. A gloved hand adjusted a recording lens in a close shot, then the clip shifted. The feed ended on a cramped room where the investigator stood before a desk. Clothing lay scattered and monitors glowed as he logged gestures and audio mentions. He noted the name number remained audible and bookmarked every suspect motion precisely. He paused, rewound, and compared timestamps against the case file notes carefully. His face registered calm focus as he prepared to trace the vehicle route. The investigator replayed the footage frame by frame and matched every timestamp to his notes. Dawn slid across a long highway as a single car drove toward the distant skyline. A brief exchange occurred in a dim corridor where one speaker asked about a girl's survival. The camera cut to the car interior, showing a hooded occupant who kept both hands near the wheel and avoided direct eye contact. A close lens shot showed a gloved hand adjusting a recorder before the clip shifted again. Back at his desk, the investigator reviewed a photograph of a young woman under harsh light. A scanning overlay flared red across the image, and the investigator's vision tightened in alarm. He paused, rewound, and noted that number remained the only identified lead to pursue, then prepared to trace the vehicle route. The investigator froze the frame on a narrow apartment corridor lit by a single ceiling lamp. Footsteps echoed down the hall, while a phone screen displayed a time-stamped mobile report and report number. The recording flagged Unit 305 and left the details line blank. Unnai pressed the camera close and whispered urgent pleas, insisting someone stood just beyond her door. She begged dispatch to hurry and demanded the police arrest him. The door labeled 305 filled the frame as a heavy silence closed around it. Low hollow thuds and a drawn-out groan suggested a presence lingering outside. The investigator noted the caller's panic and the incomplete incident details, then prioritized the recording for immediate signal tracing. The investigator froze a frantic mobile feed from Unit 305 and noted the blank incident details. Unnai pressed the camera to her face and begged dispatch for immediate police, insisting someone lingered beyond her door. Footsteps echoed down the hall, and low hollow thuds followed a drawn-out groan, suggesting a presence. The investigator prioritized the recording for tracing despite incomplete metadata. On camera, Unnai confronted an unseen figure and demanded arrests before someone died. A shadowed man filled the frame, eyes wide and grinning in cruel delight as he taunted officers. The feed plunged to black and a title card appeared. The sequence ended on a solitary car driving a winding road. The timeline then advanced with a caption reading 9 hours later. The investigator had frozen the frantic Unit 305 feed and logged its scant metadata. On that recording, Unnai had pressed the camera to her face and begged dispatch for police as a presence lingered beyond her door. Footsteps echoed and hollow thuds followed a drawn-out groan until a shadowed man filled the frame, grinning as he taunted officers. The feed cut to black, and a solitary car drove away along a winding road. 9 hours later, Unknown sat on a folding chair beside a parked van and ate cereal, while Unknown Man remained inside, silhouetted and mostly silent. She teased him about his limited food and asked if he had anything besides cereal. Unknown Man answered tersely and said he also ate eggs and chicken breast. Their exchange stayed clipped and guarded as both kept their eyes on the perimeter. The investigator paused the Unit 305 feed and saved its sparse metadata. On that footage, Unknown pressed the camera to her face and begged for police. Footsteps and hollow thuds tracked past until a grinning man filled the frame. The feed cut and a car drove away along a winding road. Hours later, Unknown sat on a folding chair beside a parked van and ate cereal. Unknown Man remained silhouetted inside, and their exchange stayed clipped and guarded throughout. They counted days and noted the date in quiet, tense lines. When he warned that the police already knew her face, Unknown pushed back. He parked the van in a dark alley and watched the perimeter without speaking. The investigator logged these movements and looked for links to the earlier attack. The investigator reviewed the building's footage from above and noted the courtyard movements. Unknown moved down the path, paused, and climbed the stairs toward a secluded landing. She entered a small room and ate with several people who kept polite distance. Her face tightened. She tried to speak, then swallowed and fell silent. A dark van idled near a gated alley, while an unknown man remained silhouetted inside. The camera cut between interior stillness and the van's patient presence outside. Rain clouds gathered over the compound as the investigator logged timestamps and routes. He compared faces to earlier attack images and flagged the alley as relevant. The footage showed Unknown return toward danger and left the motive unclear to investigators. The investigator watched the van footage frame by frame. A tall silhouette sat inside while rain blurred the window. Unknown screamed from the vehicle interior, then fell into a frantic silence. A shirtless man stepped forward and bared wounds as he moved toward the light. A gloved hand reached into view and closed on something small. The van occupant spoke and began to count aloud, naming escape routes in measured tones. The voice referenced another alley and a river turn as options. A bright golden flare then erupted between the figures.